Savannah, speaking of which, there is now much talk about the college football playoff. The first committee selections will come out next week, and Georgia's my number 2 team in the country right now behind Alabama. I've had them there for quite some time. I think they have the quality schedule, and that's what I'm going by. I'm not necessarily considering them to be the second best team in the country, but I think they have the second best track record in terms of their performance, who they've beaten. They obviously haven't lost, and the fashion of dominance in which they've won these games. So there has to be a little college football playoff surrounding Bulldog Nation right now.
Oh, yeah. We get all kinds of comments and stuff like that on our boards, and then me just looking through Twitter, everybody hyping Georgia up. I love that everybody is hyping Georgia up. However, I feel like it's still a little early, in my opinion. We have dominated people, and we have dominated all of these opponents, except for Notre Dame winning by 1 point. But I think that's defining Georgia's season, is their tenacity to go out there and win no matter what. I think that if Georgia continues to improve each week, they are definitely a college football playoff contender. I think that if they went out and get beat by Alabama close, I still think that Georgia could be considered to be in there. I think that we're at least number 4 right now. I have to give credit to Penn State and to TCU and to Alabama, of course, but at the same time, I don't want to kind of get my hopes up or get the entire Bulldog Nation hopes up by saying, yeah, we're playoff contenders, when we just need to continue to improve each week. We need to stop the run better. Our secondary is one area in our defense that I think that meant giving up that many yards against Missouri. Giving up so many yards against Missouri was just unacceptable, and it hurt our total average, which is like with Kirby Smart. He thought that was just unacceptable. He just did not think that they performed up to par. I think Georgia's going to have to continue to force turnovers. We're going to have to make bigger plays. We're going to have to get to the quarterback more before anybody really pushes us to be a contender to beat Alabama in the first place. So our road to the college football playoffs is through Alabama, and if we can compete, and if there's a miracle happening and we defeat Alabama, then I think Georgia has a very, very large opportunity to win at least a semifinal game, if not the entire thing. And that's kind of surreal for me to say, because going 8-4 last season and seeing some of the areas that Georgia struggled in, especially with offensive play calling, and then some of the areas of defense, like just getting in the backfield and pressuring quarterbacks. Never thought Georgia would have made this big of a jump and improvements and stuff like that. But I guess that's just going back to the culture change and how the team is completely bought into Kirby Smart's process. It's exciting. People in Athens are getting exciting. All the beat writers are chatting away about it, and this is just it's awesome to be able to be a part of this entire opportunity.
So, Savannah, I don't want to knock you down a little bit, but I believe it was 7-5 last year. Then you won the bowl game, right? 8-5.
Yeah, 8-5.
So
yeah.
we got. Let's see. So, not to get ahead on the college football playoff talk, and I think you're going to take care of business and make it to the SEC championship game. Georgia has just proven at this point in the season, through 7 games, to be by far, it's not even close, the best team in the SEC Eastern Division. But technically speaking, if you trip up somewhere and have a date, let's say you trip up against Florida, then the South Carolina game becomes extremely important, because they only have they've got the 2 losses in conference. And if they can walk in with 2 losses and you've got the 1 loss in the SEC, then they can technically win the head-to-head matchup. Now, very few people think that South Carolina can beat Georgia, but it's on the table that if South Carolina has 2 losses and obviously can knock you down to a second loss, then they would win the tiebreaker. And then, of course, you've got the Auburn game, and South Carolina could sneak through the back door in the same scenario. Let's say you beat Florida, but you lose to South Carolina, then you lose to Auburn, and South Carolina catches you for the SEC Eastern Division flag. Very few people, if anybody, thinks that's going to happen. I'm just talking about what's possible. Then, of course, the SEC championship game against Alabama, and a million different scenarios that affect other conferences, or where other conferences affect the SEC. But I can see it playing out, and it would be a dilemma of all magnitude for the College Football Playoff Committee to sort out. Okay, we've got 2 teams from the SEC, 1 undefeated, so they're obviously in, they're the champion. And then we've got the other team, i.e. Georgia or Alabama, that lost a close SEC championship game against the other team that we think is the best in the country. So aren't they still one of the 4 best, but they didn't win the conference? And then we've got all these other conferences, most likely with a champion with 1 loss, whether that's Clemson, Ohio State, Penn State, whoever it is, multiple conferences, and obviously the Big 12 in play still, and the Pac-12 is reeling and probably won't be able to make it. You do have the tiebreaker on Notre Dame, though. That could prove to be very decisive right there. Of course, with Notre Dame taking on NC State, they still have Stanford and Miami. If they win those games, they have one of the most impressive resumes in the country. But if they've got 1 loss and Georgia's got 1 loss, and especially winning at Notre Dame, that would be something that the College Football Playoff Committee would have to sort through. And I think the nod would obviously have to go to Georgia, especially since Notre Dame doesn't play in a conference and can't hold up a conference championship flag. So Georgia seems to be in pretty good shape.
I have to agree with you there. If it does come to the situation where they're going to have to decide 2 SEC teams or not, I think it's going to initially break into should we expand this from a 14 playoff into a 6 or an 18 playoff? Because going back with the BCS stuff and even with the Alabama LSU national championship game, there's different people all over the country just complaining about, like that's not fair, that's not fair. But when you have 2 teams that are the best in the country and they just happen to come from the SEC, it's kind of hard to tell the other team, like, oh, well, because you're in the same conference, you can't play for a national championship against someone else that you just played. It's just kind of – that's why, in all honesty, I think we should have started the playoffs with either a 6 or an 18 spread.
Oh, I totally agree. You obviously have a built-in dilemma when you've got 5 conferences and you've got 4 spots. So you obviously have an issue, and most of the time the conference champions have 1 loss, and so somebody gets kicked out. Somebody gets kicked out automatically in last season because Ohio State was deemed to be one of the 4 best. You had 2 teams kicked out, and then if Notre Dame, and we knew that this was going to come at some point, that Notre Dame was going to get its act together, and maybe they lose another game and then they're out of it anyway, but that Notre Dame was going to become a factor, and then you potentially knock out 2 teams that won conference championships, or you have the Alabama-Georgia scenario where we think 2 of the 4 best teams in the country. I try to emphasize that because we really don't know. They would have to go out and play the other teams for us to know for sure, but it looks like 2 of the 4 best teams in the country right now, and if it plays out where they stay undefeated, are from the SEC. And probably a difficult pill for a lot of conferences and fan bases from other conferences to swallow, because for a long time this was considered the best conference, and I don't think there was an argument was the best conference in the country, but few people think that right now. So it's just we'll have to see it play out, and I know some of these teams are going to play themselves out of it. There are a lot of huge games across the country in the next 5 weeks that are going to sort most of this out, but I still see a situation that's going to cause for a difficult decision by the College Football Playoff Committee. All right, Savannah Lee Richardson talking of the Bulldogs with Georgia taking on Florida in the world's largest cocktail party this Saturday. You can join Savannah on Bulldog Illustrated for the very best in Georgia football coverage. Savannah, we always appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me again.